Stop acting like a martyr. He didn't raise his voice when he said it. That's what made it worse. It landed flat in the room, calm and sharp at the same time, like he'd rehearsed it, like he knew exactly how it would sound with other people around. Chairs didn't move, no one gasped, but I felt every eye shift toward me all at once. I remember the way my fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Not enough for anyone to notice, just enough that I felt it. My nails pressed into my skin, a small, private reminder that I was still here. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd misheard him. Martyr. The word sat there between us, heavy and unfair, like something I'd volunteered to be. Like everything I'd done had been for attention instead of survival. No one defended me. No one asked what he meant. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else looked down at their phone, suddenly very interested in the screen. Across the room, I caught a familiar expression on my sister's face. Not sympathy, not surprise, relief. As if he'd finally said what everyone else was thinking. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, slow, loud, steady. Say something, a voice in my head whispered. Correct him, explain. Don't let that sit there. I opened my mouth, just slightly, then closed it again. Because the truth was, if I started talking, I wouldn't know where to stop. There were years packed into that one word. Early mornings, late nights, promises I'd kept when no one else did. Things I'd absorbed quietly so no one else had to. And I knew, standing there with that many people watching, that none of it would matter. Not right now, not in this room. Silence stretched longer than it should have. Long enough that it became uncomfortable. Long enough that someone shifted in their seat, long enough that his confidence grew instead of shrinking. He leaned back satisfied, like my quiet had confirmed something for him. I felt the heat rise in my face, then settle. A strange calm followed, heavy but controlled. I straightened my shoulders, kept my eyes steady, and said nothing at all. That's when I realized something had changed. Not in them, in me. And I didn't understand it yet, but that moment, the one where everyone watched me stay quiet, was the beginning of something none of us were prepared for. Before that moment, before that word was ever used against me, my life was made up of quiet routines that didn't look impressive from the outside. I woke up before the sun because it was the only time the house was still. I learned how to move silently, how to shower without waking anyone, how to make coffee without clinking the mug against the counter. Mornings were calculated, lunches packed while checking the clock, shoes lined up by the door so no one would be late. I didn't think of myself as strong back then. I thought of myself as responsible. Being a single mother didn't come with dramatic scenes or constant tears. It came with math, numbers that had to work, groceries that had to last, decisions that had to be made quickly and lived with quietly. If something broke, I fixed it or learned how to. If someone got sick, I stayed up. If money got tight, I adjusted. I didn't announce it, I just did it. There was never a conversation about whether I could handle things. Everyone assumed I would, and they were right. I was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who showed up early and left late, the one who filled in gaps without asking whose responsibility they were. When someone needed help, they called me, not because I had the most to give, but because I never said no. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, that became my role. No one asked if I was tired. No one noticed when I stopped replacing things for myself. No one saw the way I paused before buying anything that wasn't necessary. Appreciation didn't disappear all at once. It faded. It became assumed, like oxygen, important but invisible. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was finally quiet again, I would sit on the edge of the bed and let myself feel it. Not sadness exactly, more like a dull awareness, a sense that if I disappeared for a week, things would fall apart, but if I disappeared emotionally, no one would notice. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't doing any of it for recognition. I was doing it because it needed to be done. But there were moments, small ones, that stayed with me. The way conversations would stop when I mentioned being tired. The way people joked about how I always manage. The way help was offered to others, never to me. I learned how to smile through it, how to make it look easy, how to say, it's fine, and mean, I'll handle it. What I didn't realize then was how dangerous that image was becoming. Because when you carry everything without complaint, people stop seeing the weight. And when they stop seeing the weight, they start believing you chose it, that you wanted it, that you were somehow benefiting from it. By the time things began to shift, by the time decisions were being made without me, assumptions being spoken for me, I was already locked into a version of myself I hadn't agreed to. The reliable one, the quiet one, the one who doesn't need anything. And I didn't yet understand that the very things that had kept my life together were about to be used as proof that I deserved what was coming next. The first sign didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like being forgotten. I heard about the decision secondhand, in a casual tone, as if it were already old news. Someone mentioned it in passing, mid-conversation, like it was a detail I'd simply missed. "Oh, you know about that, right?" I didn't, but I nodded anyway. It was about money at first, not a large amount, just enough to matter, just enough that it should have included me. Plans had been made, accounts shifted, expectations set. My name wasn't part of the conversation, even though the outcome would land squarely on me. When I finally asked, carefully, quietly, the response came too quickly. It wasn't personal. That sentence should have warned me. It always sounds rehearsed when it's covering something else. Another voice added, "We assumed you'd be okay with it." Assumed. As if my agreement was implied. As if my silence had already signed something away. I remember standing there, listening, trying to line up the words in my head. There was no anger yet, just confusion. A strange floating feeling, like the ground had shifted a few inches and I was still adjusting my balance. I replayed the conversation later, alone. Every pause, every glance exchanged between them before answering me. The way no one met my eyes when I asked why I hadn't been told. "You're strong," someone said, as if it explained everything. "You always figure things out." That was when the numbness set in. It spread quietly. I went through my days on autopilot, packed lunches, answered emails, smiled at the right moments. But underneath, something was hollowing out. I kept telling myself there had been a misunderstanding, that if I just listened a little longer, it would make sense. Then came the second realization. It wasn't just one decision. There were others, small ones, conversations I hadn't been invited into, opinions formed about me without me, stories told in my absence, my role simplified, my effort minimized. I caught pieces of it in offhand comments. "Well, you didn't say anything. We thought you agreed. You didn't object." Each sentence landed like a quiet accusation, I started to see the pattern then. My silence, something I'd relied on for survival, was being rewritten as consent. My reliability was being reframed as availability. My endurance as entitlement. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, because I was stunned. There's a specific kind of disbelief that comes when the people you trust begin speaking a language you don't recognize. I kept waiting for someone to step in and say, "This isn't right," for someone to acknowledge what was happening. No one did. And in that space between what I knew I had given and what they were now taking, I realized something else, something colder and harder to ignore. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a choice, and they were all making it without me. Once the shift happened, it didn't announce itself. It seeped in. The tone changed first. Conversations grew shorter when I spoke. Answers came wrapped in patience that felt forced, practiced. The kind people use when they've already decided you're being unreasonable. When I tried to ask questions carefully without accusation, I was met with sighs. "You're overthinking this." I heard it more than once, always said gently, always followed by a look that suggested concern, not dismissal, as if the problem wasn't what had happened, but my reaction to it. Another time, someone laughed softly and said, "Why are you making this into a big deal?" I remember staring at the floor while they spoke, focusing on a small scratch near the leg of the chair. It was easier than looking at their faces, easier than trying to explain something that already felt invisible. The labels came next. Difficult, emotional, sensitive. Not said directly to me at first. I heard them through others, through careful wording that softened the edges but not the meaning. "She's just stressed. She's been under a lot. You know how she gets." As if this was a phase, as if my discomfort was an inconvenience everyone else had to manage. I was advised to let it go, to keep the peace, to think about the children, to remember that family is family. No one said, "You're right." No one said, "This shouldn't have happened." Instead, I was encouraged to smooth things over, to apologize for the tension, to make it easier for everyone else to move on. And I almost did. There were moments, late at night when the house was quiet, when I questioned myself. I replayed conversations, searching for where I might have misstepped. Maybe I had expected too much. Maybe I should have spoken sooner. Maybe my silence had really meant something else. That doubt was the heaviest part, because the more I stayed calm, the more composed I appeared, the easier it became for them to believe their version. My lack of visible distress was used as evidence that nothing serious had happened. I noticed how conversations stopped when I entered a room, how messages went unanswered, then answered hours later with polite distance, how decisions were discussed around me instead of with me. Still, I didn't raise my voice. Still, I didn't demand explanations. I watched. I listened. I learned how easily reality could be adjusted when enough people agreed on a different version of it. The pressure built quietly, not as confrontation, but as expectation. The expectation that I would absorb this too, that I would bend as I always had and let the discomfort pass through me so no one else had to feel it. And for a while, I did nothing to stop it. But somewhere beneath the calm, beneath the practiced silence, something was tightening, slowly, deliberately. And I could feel that if it snapped, it wouldn't sound like anger. It would sound like certainty. The moment I understood the stakes had changed was the moment my children were mentioned. Not directly, not cruelly, just casually folded into conversation like a reasonable concern. "Well, you have to think about how this affects the kids." The words were calm, almost caring, and yet they landed heavier than anything else had so far, because now it wasn't just about me. It never really had been, but this made it clear. Whatever decisions were being made, whatever narratives were being shaped, would ripple outward. That's when the pressure stopped being abstract. Money became tighter, not because there was less of it, but because access shifted. Agreements I thought were understood were suddenly never confirmed. Support that had been promised became conditional. Every conversation carried an unspoken message. Comply and things stay manageable. Resist and they get complicated. I felt it in small moments. A bill I hadn't expected, a deadline moved up without warning, a comment about how unstable things could become. No one threatened me outright. They didn't have to. The implication was enough. I could feel eyes on me in group settings, waiting for emotion, waiting for me to finally lose my composure so they could point to it and say, "See, this is what we mean." But I didn't give it to them. Instead, I became quieter. I started paying closer attention to what was said and what wasn't. I noticed how stories shifted depending on who was in the room, how concern for my well-being only surfaced when it supported someone else's argument. Someone said, half smiling, "You're not as innocent as you pretend." I remember the exact moment, the way the room seemed to hold its breath, the way that sentence hovered, waiting to provoke something. I felt the urge rise, sharp, immediate, a rush of words pressing at the back of my throat. I swallowed them, not because I agreed, not because I was afraid, but because I could see it then, clearly. They needed me to react. They needed tears or anger or desperation, something visible they could frame as instability, something that would justify everything they'd already decided. So I gave them nothing. I focused on logistics, on facts, on what I could control. I wrote things down. I saved messages. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already stopped listening. Inside, the fear was real. I won't pretend it wasn't. The weight of it sat in my chest at night, pressing down when the lights were off and the house was quiet. But even that fear became contained, directed. Because the more cornered I became, the clearer one thing grew. This wasn't about resolving a conflict anymore. It was about endurance. And they were waiting for me to break, not realizing I was already learning how not to. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic realization, no single thought that changed everything. It happened in the quiet. One night, after everyone else was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, the glow from my phone barely enough to see by. I wasn't crying. I wasn't spiraling. I was just still, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I read through messages I'd already read a dozen times. The same words looked different now. The pauses between replies, the careful phrasing, the way responsibility was always implied, never stated. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to fix it. That question had guided me for years. How do I make this easier? How do I smooth this over? How do I keep everything from falling apart? And in that silence, another thought surfaced, quiet but steady. What if it's not mine to fix? The question startled me, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt unfamiliar. I let it sit there without pushing it away, without immediately replacing it with guilt. I realized then how much energy I had spent trying to be understood, explaining my intentions, clarifying my tone, softening my words so no one else would feel uncomfortable, and how little of that effort had ever been returned. So I stopped. Not publicly, not dramatically. I didn't announce anything or confront anyone. I just withdrew my explanations. When assumptions were made, I didn't rush to correct them. When I was misunderstood, I didn't scramble to fix the story. I began gathering information instead of opinions, documents, dates, details I had once trusted others to remember. I reached out quietly to someone who didn't know the family dynamics, who had no emotional stake in seeing me as anything other than factual. It wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of clarity. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel relieved. What I felt was strangely grounded, like I'd placed my feet somewhere solid after standing too long on shifting ground. No one noticed the change at first. They still spoke to me the same way, still assumed my compliance, still mistook my calm for passivity. And I let them. Because for the first time, I understood something that made me patient. I didn't need to convince anyone anymore. I just needed the truth to exist, somewhere outside their version of me. And once I saw that path, even faintly, I knew there was no going back to who I'd been before.
The room was smaller than I expected. Plain, neutral, the kind of place designed to strip emotion out of everything and leave only facts behind. A table, a few chairs, a clock on the wall that ticked louder than it should have. I sat down without speaking. Across from me, they looked confident, relaxed even. This wasn't new territory for them. They'd already rehearsed their version enough times that it felt settled, final. When the questions started, I answered simply. No commentary, no backstory, just what was asked. Dates, amounts, agreements. I watched as the tone shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. A pause where there hadn't been one, a request for clarification that hadn't been directed at me. Can you show that? I slid the paper forward. I didn't look at anyone while it was read. I focused on the edge of the table, on the steady sound of my own breathing. There was a strange calm in letting the facts speak. They didn't rush. They didn't explain themselves. They just existed. Another document was requested, then another. The room grew quieter. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else leaned back, arms crossing, confidence draining into something tighter. I noticed how eye contact became brief, then non-existent. A question was asked again, this time not of me. There was a hesitation before it was answered, a glance in my direction that lasted just a second too long. I felt it then. Not satisfaction, not relief, recognition. Not of my pain, but of reality. The version of events that had floated so easily in casual conversations didn't hold up here. Without tone, without implication, without me filling in the gaps, it collapsed under its own weight. I remained still. When something was said that wasn't accurate, I corrected it once. Quietly. Precisely. No edge in my voice. No need to emphasize. That was enough. I could sense the shift fully now, the way authority settled in a different place, the way the room no longer revolved around managing me, but around understanding what had actually happened. At one point, someone tried to soften it. We just didn't realize. The sentence wasn't finished. It didn't need to be. I looked up then, meeting their eyes for the first time. Not with anger, not with accusation, just with a steadiness that surprised even me. There was nothing left to prove. When it was over, chairs moved back, papers were gathered, polite words were exchanged that hadn't existed when we walked in. No one apologized. Not directly. But they didn't need to be. Because as I stood to leave, I understood something with complete clarity. The moment they finally listened was the moment I no longer needed them to. The days after were quieter than I expected. No dramatic phone calls, no emotional confrontations, just a subtle reordering of things, like furniture moved an inch to the left, enough that you notice if you're paying attention. People spoke to me differently, more carefully, less certain. Some avoided me altogether. Others tried to pick up conversations where they'd left off, as if nothing significant had happened, as if clarity hadn't shifted the ground beneath all of us. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain what the process had been like, or how close I'd come to doubting myself. I didn't list what I'd endured quietly. I didn't need to. Boundaries settled into place without announcement. I stopped volunteering information, stopped filling silences that weren't mine to carry. When something felt off, I trusted that instinct instead of overriding it for the sake of peace. There was no grand sense of victory, just space. Space to breathe without waiting for permission. Space where my children didn't feel like leverage in someone else's argument. Space where I could move through my days without rehearsing explanations in my head. Forgiveness was never discussed, and I didn't offer it the way people expect, clean, immediate, absolving. What I offered instead was distance, clarity, a refusal to return to a version of myself that had been convenient for everyone but me. Sometimes late at night, I think back to that moment, the one where everyone watched me stay quiet when I was accused of being something I wasn't. I understand it differently now. Silence wasn't surrender. It was endurance. It was choosing to survive the misunderstanding long enough for truth to have somewhere solid to land. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been labeled for staying quiet or misunderstood for holding things together, you're not alone. And if you've lived through something like this, I'd like to hear from you. Share your thoughts below. Quiet strength has a way of finding other quiet strength. Stay with this channel if stories like this matter to you.